get out now.
We're not cleared this. There's blood all over it, though. You want to...
Can't back out. Everybody back out.
Dismembered limbs, a head boiling in a pot, and a blood-soaked home. These were the horrifying sight that greeted officers during a welfare check at the Guy family's residence. Now, every parent dreams of giving their child the best, teaching them life lessons, nurturing them, and always keeping a protective eye, even after they've grown into adults. That was true for the Guy family, but tragically this deep bond became the very reason behind one of the most horrifying parental murders in history. Before we dive in, a warning. This story isn't for the faint of heart. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The chilling details are not only graphic, but will shake you to your core. This is, without a doubt, one of the most brutal crimes a child could ever commit against their parents. And soon, you'll understand why. To really understand what went down, we first need to take a closer look at the parents involved. Now, if you're imagining them as strict or abusive types, think again. They were actually the complete opposite. Starting with the father, Joel Guy Sr. Those who were close to him called him Michael, so for the rest of this story, we'll stick with that name. Michael was born on February 10, 1955, and he worked as a pipeline engineer. With his experience in the field, it's safe to say he was doing well for himself. He earned a solid salary, enough to comfortably support his growing family. Anyone who knew Michael would tell you he wasn't just kind, he was the type of person who made you feel seen and cared for, always willing to lend a hand or give advice, even when you didn't ask for it. He took immense pride in everything he did, whether it was his career or his family, and he made sure the people around him felt that pride too. If you were close to Michael, you knew he wasn't just a dad or a husband. He was someone who genuinely cared and wanted to make sure everyone around him was doing well. Now, Michael had 3 daughters from his first marriage. While the reasons behind the divorce weren't entirely clear, one thing was certain. The daughters held no grudges against their father. They had always maintained a good relationship with him, and that didn't change when he remarried. Michael's second wife, Lisa, was as kind-hearted as he was. Just like Michael, Lisa was someone who made everyone feel welcome and cared for. His daughters quickly warmed up to her, and there was no drama or resentment. Lisa treated them like her own children, showering them with love and affection. This was evident when one of Michael's daughters testified in court, explaining how Lisa became a mother figure in her life. She even went as far as to get an engagement ring that resembled Lisa's. She remembered all the small details about Lisa, the favorite shirt, the favorite cups, and everything else that made Lisa so special to her.
Lisa's been in my life my entire life, and they had said it 3, but she's been my entire memory. And so we would go in the summers. Dad would have us for a month in the summer because they always lived so far away, and Angela and I would go visit for the entire month. But the dynamics of that was my mom was a single mom, so there's struggles with single moms. But when we went to Lisa's house, her cabinets were stocked with food, and she greeted Dad like the perfect Walton family. When they would come home, dinner would be cooked with meat and side dishes, and there would be candy in the shelves, and I just would watch her, and I watched her growing up like she was the mom, or that dream that you have to have a double parent home, to where she loved, like, I so wanted to be this woman that my first engagement ring was her exact engagement ring, and I wanted to be the mom she was. She would sit in her little brown Sperry brown shirt. She had a really high arch in her foot, and just with her cup, I wanted to even, at certain points in my life, I walked around with a cup that had like the little square placement under it, because I wanted to be her. I wanted to be the mom that she was.
Just like you just heard, this wasn't a mom who abused her children or mistreated them in a way that made them feel unloved. It's clear just from the words of her stepdaughter alone that Lisa poured love into every single member of her family. Additionally, Lisa worked in human resources at an engineering firm and was known for being reliable and generous. She was the kind of person who, no matter how busy she was, would stop to comfort a stranger in distress. She had a big heart, always putting others first. From this perspective, it was evident that both Michael and Lisa were known for their giving nature, and to everyone around them, they seemed like the perfect couple. Soulmates living a perfect life. However, everything began to change when Michael and Lisa welcomed their only biological child together, Joel Guy Jr. That moment marked the start of a shift no one could have foreseen. Unlike his warm and kind parents, Joel was reportedly the complete opposite, cold and distant to almost everyone. In fact, Joel Guy Jr.'s life before 2016 remains a mystery in many ways. Even his half-sisters, who grew up alongside him, admitted they didn't really know him. Whenever they visited, Joel would lock himself in his room, avoiding any interaction with family. On the rare occasions he did speak, he was dismissive and rude, treating his relatives as if they were beneath him. Over time, most of the family distanced themselves, choosing not to engage with Joel unless absolutely necessary. Joel's behavior was fueled by an inflated ego, believing he was the smartest person in the room at all times. This confidence was bolstered during his school years, especially when he performed well academically. In his final years of high school, he attended the prestigious Louisiana School for Math, Science, and the Arts, a magnet school known for its small elite class sizes. Getting accepted into the class of 2006 only reinforced Joel's belief in his superiority. After high school, he enrolled at George Washington University for one semester before transferring to Louisiana State University, where he pursued studies to become a plastic surgeon. However, Joel never became a plastic surgeon, or held any job for that matter. While he was in school, up until the age of 28, he lived entirely off his mother Lisa's income. Lisa, who worked full-time in human resources at Oak Ridge Engineering, sent her paychecks directly to Joel. Michael and Lisa decided to fully support Joel so he could focus on his studies without worrying about finances. They paid for his tuition, housing, and other expenses, hoping he'd graduate quickly and start his career, but their generosity backfired. Joel began to see this financial support not as a gift, but as something he was entitled to, his birthright. He believed his parents owed him this money simply because they were his parents. Though he claimed to be working hard toward his goals, Joel was far less focused on school than he led his parents to believe. Living alone in Baton Rouge, he spent his time doing whatever he wanted, completely oblivious to the financial strain he was placing on his family. He didn't understand or care about the sacrifices his parents were making for him. However, in 2016, things began to change. Michael, Joel's father, lost his job and took a hard look at their finances. He realized that he and Lisa could retire if they stopped supporting Joel and sold their family home. Excited for this new chapter, Michael and Lisa shared their plans with their daughters in the family group chat. They explained that they intended to move into Michael's parents' home and stop financially supporting Joel. However, they were nervous about how Joel would react to the news. At 28 years old, Joel had never been financially independent, and his parents worried about what he would do once the financial support stopped. Despite their concerns, Thanksgiving that year seemed like a turning point. For the Guy family, Thanksgiving was always a big deal, a time when everyone gathered at Michael and Lisa's home to celebrate, including their daughters, extended family, and their new families. So just like any other normal family, that year was very joyful for the Guy family. The adults gathered in the garage, enjoying their cigarettes and catching up, while the kids ran around, and the aroma of delicious food filled the house. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, at every Thanksgiving, there's always that one person who locks themselves away, avoiding everyone. And in the Guy family, that was always Joel. However, this year was different, shockingly so. For the first time ever, Joel actively engaged with his family. He surprised everyone by playing with his stepsister's kids, children whose names his sisters doubted he even knew before that day. He brought them upstairs to his old room and gifted them toys his parents had lovingly preserved from his childhood. Joel laughed, joked, and even posed for family photos, a rarity that caught everyone off guard. His sudden shift in behavior was so remarkable that his sisters whispered to each other about how he might finally be turning over a new leaf. What made Joel's transformation even more puzzling was its timing. Just weeks earlier, Lisa had told him that she had given her 2 weeks' notice at work. She and Michael planned to retire, sell the family home, and stop financially supporting him. Originally, they'd intended to break the news at Christmas, but Lisa decided to tell Joel early, hoping to give him time to prepare for independence. Everyone braced for a meltdown or tantrum, but instead, Joel seemed fine. More than fine, actually. He appeared happier and more social than anyone had ever seen him. His family took this as a positive sign. Maybe this was the wake-up call Joel needed. Perhaps he'd already made peace with the idea of standing on his own 2 feet and was reconnecting with his family as part of a fresh start. One of his sisters even mentioned to Michael that Joel might be trying to repair their relationship. Still, Michael held firm that they wouldn't resume funding his lifestyle, no matter how well he was behaving. Little did they know, Joel's cheerful demeanor masked something far darker. While he was smiling and bonding with his family, he was also laying the groundwork for a chilling plan. That day, Joel brought over 2 large plastic tubs, which he carried into the house without much explanation. They seemed heavy, but no one thought to ask what they contained. What they didn't know was that Joel had spent weeks plotting his parents' murders. Those tubs held the tools he intended to use in his gruesome plan. As it turned out, Joel wasn't handling the loss of his financial lifeline as gracefully as he appeared. When Lisa told him they were cutting him off, Joel didn't see it as a push toward independence. He saw it as a betrayal. He decided to take matters into his own hands, crafting a plan to murder his parents, frame his father for his mother's death, and stage it all as a murder-suicide. In Joel's warped mind, he was a genius, capable of orchestrating the perfect crime. His education and endless hours of watching crime, shows like Law and Order, convinced him that he could pull it off without a hitch. But while Joel once excelled in academics, his arrogance blinded him to his own shortcomings. So, instead of heading back to his apartment like usual, Joel decided to stick around at his parents' house for 2 whole days. At first, Lisa and Michael probably thought it was a nice change. Maybe Joel was feeling sentimental about the family house before they sold it. After all, with Lisa preparing for retirement, they were all gearing up for a big life change, and the idea that Joel might actually want to spend some time with his family seemed like a nice, albeit unexpected gesture. But things took a strange turn. Just 2 weeks before Lisa was set to retire, her co-workers and boss had been planning a celebratory send-off for her. She was well-liked, dependable, and a hard worker who would always communicate if anything was off. So when November 28th came around and Lisa didn't show up for work, Jennifer, her boss, started to worry. It wasn't like Lisa to just vanish without a word, especially since she'd been so involved in the retirement celebration plans. Jennifer tried calling her several times, but there was no answer. Then she reached out to Michael, but he didn't pick up either. That was strange. Lisa and Michael were the kind of people who always made sure to check in, even if something came up. This wasn't adding up, and Jennifer knew it. So after a couple more unanswered calls, Jennifer made the decision to call the non-emergency police line and request a welfare check at the Guy family home.
My name is Jennifer Whited, W-H-I-T-E-D.
And what company are you with?
Jacobs Engineering.
And what's a good callback for you guys?
It is 865-216-6625.
Okay, what's the employee's name?
Lisa Guy, G-U-Y. Her husband's name is Joel, J-O-E-L.
Should he be there too? Does he live with her?
Yes, he does.
Okay.
And they do have a dog named Jake. I think he's a big baby.
Okay. How old is she, do you know?
She is in her, I think, late 50s.
Do you know if she has any medical issues?
No, I mean, she has high blood pressure, but that's all that I know of. Yeah, I know that their house is for sale, and they are moving, and she is leaving our company, but that's supposed to be Friday, and this definitely isn't like her just not to show up.
When the officers first arrived at the house, everything seemed normal, so they didn't think much of it and were about to call it off. But Jennifer, Lisa's boss, wasn't convinced. She had a gut feeling something wasn't right, so she called again. What they uncovered next was something no one could have prepared for. During a thorough check, the officers noticed a few strange things. The house had a "for sale" sign out front, but something seemed off. There was no lockbox on the front door for a realtor's key, and the doorknob didn't look like it had been there long. It didn't even match the door. It had obvious signs of being tampered with, likely with a screwdriver. Not wasting any time, the officers decided to check the back of the house. And that's when things took an even darker turn. The back door was missing its doorknob altogether. One officer peered through the hole where the knob should have been and was immediately hit with a blast of heat from inside the house. But that wasn't the worst part. There was a sharp, chemical smell hanging in the air. It was the kind of smell that instantly tells you something was seriously wrong. The officer looked closer and saw bottles of bleach scattered across the floor, still unopened. But the clues didn't stop there. He also noticed groceries that had been dropped at the front door, like someone had rushed inside without finishing what they were doing. That was enough for them to make their move. They headed back to the front, found an unlocked vehicle with the garage door opener inside, and used it to get access. The officers entered the house, and what happened next was all caught on body cam footage.
Hello, sheriff's office! There's Don walking in. Oh, shit.
I hear a dog howling.
Knox County Sheriff's Office!
Damn hammer.
Police! Police Department, Sheriff's Office!
The pot you saw earlier? Yeah, that was the same one Joel used to boil his mother's head for about a day. It's chilling when you think about it. Investigators first found a table with the guy's wallets and a sledgehammer on top, followed by another table with long guns. As they made their way up the stairs, they could hear a dog intermittently barking. They then spotted Michael on the floor in a hallway, and eventually discovered the dismembered bodies submerged in a solution in the bathroom. Among the other items found in the home were sewer line cleaner, a bag of baking soda, drain opener, a bottle of muriatic acid, lye, hydrogen peroxide, several bottles of bleach, a spray bottle, gloves, and trash bags. Investigators also came across a note inside an open suitcase which included the name and address of a Louisiana Ace hardware store, as well as a reference to sewer line cleaner. Given the hazardous chemicals, the Knox County Sheriff's Office hazmat team had to step in for biohazard removal. With the overwhelming amount of evidence, the KCSO Forensics Unit worked through Monday night and into the next day to process the crime scene. Now, what really happened after that Thanksgiving? On November 26th, Joel Guy Jr. attacked and killed his father in a second-floor exercise room while his mom was out shopping at Walmart. The scene was chaotic, with torn blinds, blood splattered on the walls, and an overturned Bowflex machine. The amount of blood was beyond horrific. The struggle must have been brutal. The poor man's clothes were shredded from the knife wounds, and it was reported that he was stabbed at least 40 times. However, this is just an estimate. According to the autopsy, since most of the tissue was gone when they found the body, the actual number of stabs could never be fully determined. But it doesn't stop there. Joel also dismembered the body, leaving his father's hands behind in the room. When his mom came home from Walmart, Joel tricked her into going upstairs. She was in such a rush that her groceries got scattered across the foyer. But when she reached the top of the stairs, Joel ambushed her, stabbing her in the back over and over, just like he did to his father. Blood was everywhere. The prosecution later claimed he used so much force to decapitate her that her head actually broke. And then, get this, he just chopped her up like it was nothing, then put her head in that same boiling pot on the stove. According to the medical examiner, Lisa was stabbed at least 31 times, and 9 of her ribs were completely severed. During the trial, the forensic examiner testified that the head wasn't just severed, but had been forcefully broken off. Both victims had their arms and legs detached, Mikhail at the waist and Lisa at the knees, and their body parts were placed in a bin filled with chemicals to help dissolve them. This was the very same bin that Joel had brought into the house during Thanksgiving. After death, both bodies had deep cuts made so that the chemicals could more easily penetrate the body's main cavities. So you can probably imagine how heartbreaking it must have been for both of them, loving their child and spoiling him all the way into adulthood, only for them to be brutally murdered like this. It's beyond evil. But despite Michael loving his son so much, he didn't go down without a fight. Joel sustained several cuts on his hands, including a deep gash on his left thumb. Around 3:30 p.m., he was seen in the first aid section at Walmart, buying bandages and ointment for his hand injuries. He also picked up isopropyl alcohol and hydrogen peroxide. It was also around this point that Joel returned to his apartment, likely because he was too lazy to continue with his plan. After spending 2 intense days carrying out his crime, it seems that for the first time, he was exhausted. He probably felt he had worked harder than ever before and needed a break. So, he headed back to his apartment, possibly to rest. Little did he know, it was exactly during this time that the police also uncovered what he had done. The police began questioning those closest to Michael and Lisa. When they inquired about who had been at the house that weekend, everyone pointed to Joel. His sisters revealed that he was about to be cut off financially and that his behavior over Thanksgiving had been strangely out of character. The soiled clothes found at the crime scene matched the description given by his sisters, and when investigators found a book bag containing a notebook filled with Joel's meticulous plan, it became undeniable. He was behind the murders. The only thing left to do was finalize the paperwork for his arrest. Now, the day after the bodies were discovered, Joel was arrested while heading back to the house. In his trunk, police found a KitchenAid meat grinder, a chilling indicator that he wasn't done with the gruesome process yet. But what really exposed Joel's intentions was what he had written in his notebook. From the gruesome methods of killing and dismemberment to his strategy for destroying the bodies and erasing forensic evidence, every step was carefully thought out. He planned to grind the bodies, destroy all DNA evidence with bleach and lye, and even set a fire to cover his tracks. He went as far as faking an alibi by scheduling a text message from his mother's phone, attempting to erase any evidence that could point back to him.
Get carving knives to make small pieces. Get sledgehammer, crush bones. Bring blender and food grinder, grind meat.
Keep going.
Get bleach, denature proteins. Get plastic bin for denaturation process.
Keep going.
Does not matter where they're killed. Just get rid of bloody spots to prevent evidence of time of death, not the mattress or the couches. Get rid of bodies inside house. There and my DNA already there.
Joel's motive, driven by a financial incentive, was also clearly outlined in the notebook. He calculated his parents' life insurance policies, assets, and joint property with the intention of inheriting everything. His obsession with money was evident, as he described in detail how he would inherit the full value of his mother's assets, including her life insurance, the family homes, and other financial resources. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Joel continued to buy supplies like knives, acid, and plastic bins, keeping the notebook hidden in his backpack alongside his school books. He made sure to pay in cash, thinking he was being smart and inconspicuous, but in reality, Joel's arrogance and sense of entitlement were his downfall. He believed his meticulous preparations would guarantee his success, unaware that he was overlooking the most basic human realities. Joel was so spoiled and out of touch with the real world that even while erasing his tracks, he grew lazy and decided to take a break from his gruesome task. He had no real understanding of the consequences of his actions, thinking he could simply get away with it. But what he failed to factor in was the kindness of his parents and how their disappearance would immediately raise suspicions. Despite the mountain of evidence stacked against him, Joel Guy Jr. still pleaded not guilty, dragging his family through a painful 4-day trial. He knew he couldn't win. It was clear to everyone that he was guilty, but he wasn't trying to win. Instead, he wanted to make his family suffer. By refusing to admit what he'd done, he kept control over them, forcing them to hear every ugly detail of his crime. It was like his final act of revenge, making them live through his cold, calculated cruelty. Even Joel's defense lawyer struggled to defend him. All they could muster was that Joel was a kind man who couldn't possibly commit such a horrific crime.
Friendly and happy, in a way Michelle Tyler had never seen him before. Outgoing, friendly, and happy. That was not a man about to commit a homicide. Outgoing, friendly, and happy.
But the jury wasn't swayed by this weak argument. On October 2, 2020, Joel Guy Jr. was found guilty of 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder, 3 counts of felony murder, and 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, his appeal to overturn his conviction was shot down by the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals in April 2023. With that, Joel's fate was sealed. He will now spend the rest of his life behind bars at the Northwest Correctional Complex in Tiptonville, Tennessee, where he will forever live with the consequences of the brutal crime he committed. Now, remember when we first said that not much was known about Joel's past? Well, as the trial went on, a surprising revelation came to light. Joel actually had one and only one friend. People were shocked to find that Joel had a friend he cared so deeply about that he even called him in prison to apologize. That friend's name was Michael McCracken.
Have much of a chance of being happy anymore, but you do. You do. Eventually you're going to meet somebody, and you've claimed that I haven't been an albatross or anything before, but I certainly would be now. From in freaking prison. On that basis, I think you should probably just sort of consider me dead and move on with your life. So, I'm not going to try to initiate any more contact with you beyond.
Very little is known about the nature of Joel and Michael's relationship, but it seemed that, at the very least, Joel respected him. The two met when they lived together in their high school dorms, and when Joel went off to study at George Washington University, he left after just 1 semester and transferred to Louisiana State University, where Michael was going. They ended up living in the same apartment building, and when Michael's roommate moved out, Joel moved back in with him. Some have speculated that their relationship might have been more than just friendship, but that's all we really know about the situation. When Michael was questioned about the case, he stated that he wasn't surprised that Joel had killed his parents. He explained that, over the years, Joel had become increasingly reclusive, spending weeks on end alone in his bedroom to the point where Michael sometimes didn't see him for months at a time. For whatever little comfort it may offer, Joel will spend the rest of his natural-born life in prison, exactly where he belongs. He will forever be remembered, not as the genius he thought he was, but as a gigantic fool who couldn't take care of himself and, despite his so-called wisdom, made the catastrophic mistake of leaving a notebook, a kind of manifesto, at the crime scene.
This is the worst mass murder in the history of our city.
The gruesome discovery inside a back bedroom.
As a police chief, it's something you hope would never occur, ever.
Walking out of his home with blood stains on his shirt.
It hurt so bad that somebody would do something like this. It was terrible.
Some children dream of a loving father, but for the Wesson family, a father was far from a blessing. Marcus Wesson, who seemed like just another quiet neighbor, became known as the Vampire King of Fresno when the shocking truth about his life was uncovered. It turns out he wasn't just a predator, but also the leader of a twisted cult, abusing most of his children and ultimately taking the lives of 9 of them. What makes this even more baffling is that many of his surviving children still defended him.
He did not abuse any of my family members. He's cool to me. I'm the oldest son.
They all loved him. They played with him almost every day. He's the best guy I ever had.
This leaves us all questioning. Why? The case is so disturbing that it's been labeled by news outlets as one of the worst cases of incest and mass murder in history. Stick with us, because by the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of just how twisted this truly was. Now, for starters, let's rewind to the day this all went down. It was a regular March 12, 2004 in Fresno, California, when the police received a family dispute report from the Wesson home. It turns out 2 women, along with their relatives, were demanding that Marcus Wesson, a 57-year-old man at the time, release their children. Marcus was a massive guy, well over 6 feet tall, with dreadlocks. But while the police were explaining things to Marcus, he quietly slipped back inside and locked the door behind him. That's when the first gunshot rang out. The sudden crack of the bullet shattered the tense silence, followed by a barrage of gunfire that echoed through the house. Panic set in as the police immediately surrounded the property, unsure of what was happening inside. Officers shouted for Marcus to come out, but there was no answer. Moments later, the door opened, and Marcus Wesson emerged, covered in blood, walking slowly into the daylight as though nothing had happened.
Marcus Wesson was a menace to society, and he is somebody that I'll never forget.
Inside the house, the officers uncovered a horrifying sight. 9 bodies, 7 of them children under the age of 12, were found stacked in a back bedroom. The other 2 victims were 17-year-old Elizabeth Brianni Kina Wesson and 25-year-old Sabrina April Wesson. The mothers who were desperately calling for their children on that horrific day were Sofina Solorio and Ruby Ortiz, both nieces of Marcus Wesson. In his twisted mind, he believed he was Jesus, and he thought that if anyone tried to separate the family, they would all go to heaven together. As horrifying as this belief was, it turned out there was much more to the story, and understanding his background is key to understanding what led to this horror. So Marcus was born on August 22, 1946, in Kansas City, Missouri. As the oldest of 4 children, he grew up in a home dominated by extreme religious beliefs, led by his mother, Carrie Wesson. Carrie was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and according to their relatives, the church's doctrines were strict, and Carrie was no exception. She held Bible studies with her children several times a week, focusing heavily on the apocalyptic, end-of-world teachings and the return of Christ. The Wesson family followed a strict vegetarian diet, which was common among Seventh-day Adventists. But it wasn't just their diet that was controlled. Carrie was also a brutal disciplinarian. She wasn't afraid to use violence to enforce her authority. Carrie would lash out at her children, using objects like belts, extension cords, and even switches, a flimsy, painful stick that could leave welts and bruises. But as bad as Carrie was, Marcus's father, Ben, was even worse. Ben was an alcoholic who spent nearly every night in bars, drinking heavily and picking fights. He was known for being aggressive and violent when drunk, often starting bar fights that were far from small scuffles. Marcus and his siblings often had to pick up their father from bars and motels because he was too drunk to take care of himself. Now Marcus's family was also facing major financial struggles. Ben, Marcus's father, could never keep a steady job. He bounced between odd jobs here and there, but nothing consistent. Carrie, Marcus's mother, worked as a nurse, but her salary alone couldn't support the family, especially with 4 kids to take care of. Meanwhile, Ben spent much of their money at the bar, leaving the family in a constant state of financial strain. By the time Marcus was 10, the family made the big move from Kansas City, Missouri to San Jose, California, where the rest of this story takes place. To make matters worse, Marcus had a tough time at school. Growing up in such a challenging environment already put him at a disadvantage, and things didn't get any better once he entered the classroom. When Marcus was in primary school, he was really shy and didn't talk much. He had a severe stutter, which likely made him feel even more self-conscious around others. Kids can be tough, and Marcus probably avoided speaking up because he was afraid of being teased. But as he got older and moved into his teenage years, things started to improve for him. He managed to overcome his stutter and got involved in sports, particularly track and field, where he really started to shine. Marcus became a strong athlete, and this new talent helped him feel more confident. Around this time, Marcus grew closer with a friend named Gregory. They spent a lot of time together at Marcus' house, but eventually, Marcus's father, Ben, began crossing serious boundaries with Gregory. Ben's inappropriate behavior toward Gregory began one day when he was hanging out at Marcus's house. He made uncomfortable comments, remarking about Gregory's private parts in a suggestive way. Eventually, Ben cornered Gregory and asked if he could perform oral penetration on him. Gregory immediately declined, but Ben kept pressuring him. Ben even offered Gregory $50 in exchange, which led to Gregory feeling trapped into giving in. While the full extent of the abuse is unclear, there was another time when Gregory was sleeping over at the Wesson house. He woke up to find Ben hovering over him, trying to pull down his pants. However, Gregory managed to stop him by telling Ben to stop and insisting he never wanted to be touched again. According to Gregory, that was the last time Ben attempted anything, ending the abusive behavior. Although Marcus and his siblings never said that Ben abused them, it was clear that their father was far from innocent. Fast forward to 1966, Marcus enlisted in the Army shortly after high school and served 2 years in the Vietnam War as an ambulance driver. After his service, he was honorably discharged and headed back to San Jose to live with his parents. Around this time, his grandmother and 2 cousins, 18-year-old Patricia and Larry Morgan, also moved in with Carrie and Ben, Marcus's parents. Things took a dark turn when Ben, Marcus's father, began an inappropriate relationship with his 18-year-old nephew Larry. The exact start of the relationship is unclear, but it was clear Ben had a troubling history with inappropriate behavior. Once Larry turned 18, Ben made the announcement that he and Larry were moving out to live together in Los Angeles. But despite the shocking nature of Ben's actions, Carrie and Ben didn't divorce. Instead, Carrie chose to pretend as if nothing had happened. She couldn't face the reality of what Ben had done, and in her denial, clung to the hope that he might return to her one day, and they could erase the painful chapter from their lives. For a bit of closure, Ben did eventually return to Carrie, but it wasn't until he disappeared for nearly an entire decade. He finally showed up back in San Jose sometime in the late 1970s. While all of this was unfolding within Marcus' parents' home, Marcus himself eventually met a woman named Rosemary Solorio. Rose lived just a couple of houses down from Marcus' mother's home. Additionally, Rose was a single mother of 8 children and she had recently separated from her husband, Mike. Despite the significant age gap between Marcus and Rose, he was in his early 20s while she was 34, the age difference didn't seem to bother either of them, and they quickly became a couple. However, it becomes evident that Marcus had ulterior motives for entering this relationship. Marcus Wesson, as it turns out, was a pedophile, and now he had access to Rose's 8 young children. According to official reports, Marcus never targeted any boys, but it's been documented that he molested several young girls. The first known victim was Rose's 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth plays a critical role in this story because, believe it or not, she eventually became Marcus's wife. But before we dive into her story, we need to understand just how much the family dynamics changed when Marcus entered the picture. He introduced Rose and her kids to the Seventh-day Adventist religion. Marcus would hold long Bible study sessions at their house, making the kids sit through hours of his religious talks every week. On top of that, he switched their diets to a strict vegetarian one, just like his own. If any of the kids misbehaved or did something Marcus didn't approve of, he would punish them harshly. At this point, it's clear that Marcus was starting to act a lot like his own mother. But as time went on, things only got worse. Marcus would use belts and extension cords to punish the children for even the smallest mistakes. They were used to a different kind of discipline before Marcus came along, so this was a huge shock for them. One of Rose's children, Jesse, didn't like Marcus at all. He didn't like how a young guy had come into their home and taken charge. Jesse fought back more than the others, and because of that, he ended up receiving harsher treatment. There was one time Marcus hit Jesse across the face with a belt, and when Jesse ran out of the house, Marcus chased him through the neighborhood. Another time, Jesse challenged Marcus, and Marcus whipped him repeatedly with an extension cord. The abuse became so bad that some of the boys even stopped showering at school to hide the bruises and marks on their bodies. It's natural to wonder why Rose would let Marcus come in and take over her home. The truth is, Rose was struggling. She had no job, and she had no one to help her raise the children. When Marcus came into her life, he offered help. He gave her attention, introduced her family to religion, and even helped her get on welfare so they had some financial support. At this point, Marcus wasn't working, and the family was relying solely on welfare. To make ends meet, Marcus started stealing. He'd take the kids with him to stores, have them keep an eye on employees, and grab whatever they needed without paying for it. But as bad as all this sounds, there's something much darker that we need to talk about. The abuse that Marcus began inflicting on Rose's daughter, Elizabeth. From the moment he moved in, Marcus took an interest in her, and it quickly became clear that he had inappropriate intentions. According to Elizabeth's siblings, Marcus made sure to give her special attention. He would shower her with compliments and go out of his way to make her feel important. One night, Marcus took Elizabeth outside and performed what seemed like a wedding ceremony. He asked one of her brothers to officiate, and they went through the whole process as if they were really getting married. Marcus placed a Bible in front of Elizabeth, put her hand on top of it, and then covered her hand with his own. In the months that followed, Marcus told Elizabeth that, in the eyes of God, she was his wife. He even promised that they would have a legal ceremony when she was older, but for now they were married in the eyes of God because they had sworn over the Bible. As time went on, Elizabeth began to believe that she was indeed married to Marcus. Marcus became incredibly jealous and controlling. When Elizabeth did normal things that any 9-year-old would, like playing outside with friends or going to sleepovers, Marcus would become manipulative and cold towards her when she came back. He used Elizabeth's need for affection and attention to manipulate her, often telling her that she wasn't acting like a good wife should. From this moment, Elizabeth began to feel increasingly desperate to make Marcus happy. She was so caught up in trying to earn his approval that she would beg him to accept her, crying and pleading, saying, "I am your wife. Please say I'm your wife." Marcus took advantage of her vulnerability, and each time she asked for reassurance, he would finally give in, reinforcing his control over her. This unhealthy cycle allowed Marcus to manipulate her and gain more power over her actions and decisions. In 1971, Marcus began to take advantage of Elizabeth in a deeply troubling way. The family lived in a modest home with 4 bedrooms, with the children sharing rooms and bunk beds. Elizabeth shared a room with her sisters, sleeping on the bottom bunk, while Marcus would often sleep in another room with some of the boys. At night, Marcus would secretly enter Elizabeth's room, and sometimes Elizabeth would sneak into his bed. Over time, Marcus's behavior became more inappropriate, and what started with small advances gradually escalated. This went on for years, with Marcus continuing to abuse Elizabeth. By 1973, Elizabeth was 14 years old, and Marcus was 27. Elizabeth was simply washing dishes in the kitchen when Marcus unexpectedly knelt down and proposed to her. He asked her to marry him, and although Elizabeth agreed, it's crucial to understand that as a 14-year-old, she could not legally or emotionally consent to such a proposal. In her mind, she believed she was participating in something she was expected to do, but in reality, this was a form of manipulation and abuse. Soon after, Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. While she didn't openly tell her family about it, it was becoming apparent as her pregnancy progressed. The situation was complicated, and despite her young age, Elizabeth's mother, Rose, gave her consent for Elizabeth and Marcus to marry. Since Elizabeth was underage, they had to follow the legal procedures required to obtain a marriage license. This included getting Rose's approval, which she had already provided, as well as attending counseling sessions to ensure the marriage was in the best interest of the parties involved. It's shocking that, despite the circumstances, a counselor signed off on the marriage, allowing it to proceed. By the time Elizabeth was 5 months pregnant with their first child, she and Marcus were legally married. Elizabeth was just 14, still in the 9th grade, while Marcus was 27. Around this time, they moved out of Rose's house and into Marcus's mother's home. In 1974, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy they named Dorian. Dorian was just the first of 11 children Elizabeth and Marcus would eventually have together. Marcus, Elizabeth, and Dorian moved into their own place in San Jose. Unfortunately, once they were isolated, Marcus's control over Elizabeth intensified, along with the emotional and psychological abuse. Elizabeth was overwhelmed by the responsibilities placed on her, caring for a newborn, keeping up with household chores, and attending school. At this point, she was still in high school and struggling to balance everything. She desperately wanted to finish her studies and graduate, but the weight of everything was taking its toll. Not only was she managing a newborn and a household, but Marcus was also constantly accusing her of cheating. Every time she came home from school, he would interrogate her about who she spoke to that day, especially any boys at school. Despite her assurances that she wasn't interested in anyone but him, Marcus wouldn't believe her. He would ignore her for days, using the silent treatment as a way to manipulate and break her down, just as he had done for years. In one instance, while they were sitting together, Marcus suddenly accused Elizabeth of having adulterous thoughts. Even after she denied it, he didn't believe her. Instead of his usual silent treatment, he forced her out of the house immediately. He wouldn't let her take Dorian or pack any belongings. In the pouring rain, Elizabeth was forced to walk 5 miles to her mother's house in the dark, without her son or any of her things, simply because Marcus thought she might be thinking about another man. And if you think these are the worst of it, then this is just the tip of the iceberg. As the years went on, Marcus and Elizabeth would have 10 children together, though tragically, 1 infant died. But despite that many children, the suffering didn't end there. Marcus's control over Elizabeth grew even more intense, and his threats became more violent. He made it clear that if Elizabeth ever tried to leave, he would make sure she couldn't escape, even describing in chilling detail how he would kill her if she ever attempted to break free from his grip. And sadly, the abuse didn't stop with Elizabeth. Their children also faced unimaginable hardships. Marcus ruled over every part of their lives: what they ate, how they were educated, and how they spent their time. The children were homeschooled under harsh conditions, isolated from the outside world, with no opportunity to socialize or have a normal childhood. He told the children that he was God and had them refer to him as Master or Lord. He even taught the children to be prepared for Armageddon and said that the girls were destined to become Marcus's future wives. As awful as it sounds, it only gets worse. Marcus began grooming the girls to perform inappropriate acts with him as early as 7 or 8 years old, under the guise of his disturbing teachings. This was yet another way he manipulated and controlled them, using his twisted beliefs to justify his behavior. On top of that, the girls were forced into demeaning domestic duties. They were required to wash Marcus's dreadlocks and even scratch his armpits and head, further dehumanizing them. To isolate them further, Marcus forbade the girls from speaking to their male siblings or even their own mother. Eventually, Elizabeth's younger sister left her 7 children with them, saying her drug problems made her unable to care for them. This brought the family size to 16 members. However, with Marcus unemployed, the family struggled to make ends meet. This is when the family dynamic became more complicated. Marcus began grooming her nieces as well. He would start by touching their chest and genital areas. Then he taught them oral penetration, claiming they were being trained to become better wives for him. And by the time they were into their teenage years, Marcus would begin having intercourse regularly with them. He would tell them that this was a form of love, claiming that it was how a father should show affection for his children. Additionally, Marcus would conduct wedding ceremonies with the teenage girls, starting at the age of 13, much like he had done with Elizabeth. He maintained incestuous relationships with his daughters, including his oldest, Kiani, who had 2 children with him, and his second oldest daughter, Sabrina, who had 1 child with him. He also abused his nieces, Rosa and Sofina Solorio, and Ruby Ortiz. Rosa had 2 children with Marcus, while Sofina and Ruby each had 1. Ruby was only 13 when Marcus married her. At the time, she believed he loved her, but he manipulated her by saying, "God's people are becoming extinct. We need to preserve God's children. We need to have more children for the Lord." As time went on, the neighbors couldn't help but notice the Wesson family. The kids would often wear very conservative clothes and scarves. While they said it was because of their religious beliefs, some people wondered if it was really to cover up the bruises on their bodies. This caused the family to move around a lot, and sometimes their living situations were pretty unusual. At one point, they lived on a 26-foot boat anchored in the Santa Cruz harbor. In the 1990s, they settled in a trailer and a huge army tent up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where there was no running water. They even lived for a while on a falling-apart 63-foot tugboat off the coast of Marin County, California. Around this time, Ruby, one of Marcus's nieces who was also his wife, had started working at a McDonald's. It was there that she began to see how different and beautiful life could be outside of the confined world she had known at home. She even went out with a coworker one day, before Marcus could pick her up, experiencing a small taste of freedom. But when Marcus found out, the punishment she received was so harsh that it made her realize just how trapped she truly was. Marcus didn't allow Ruby to work again after that incident, but Ruby wasn't ready to give up on her chance for freedom. At one point, when she was alone on the tugboat, she managed to escape and boarded a train to Fresno, California, hoping to find refuge with her mother. However, when she arrived, her mother urged her to return to Marcus, pressuring her to go back to the man who had controlled and abused her life for so long. Eventually, she was captured by Marcus once again and was brought back with him. Now you might be wondering, where are the other male members of the family? Well, the Wesson sons were raised separately from their sisters because Marcus discouraged contact between the sexes. He was afraid that his sons might develop feelings for their sisters. Most of the boys were sent away once they were old enough to work, but Marcus would take their entire income as part of their independence. As a result, The male children of the Wesson family knew very little about the disturbing things going on between their father and sisters. And around the time when Ruby escaped, Marcus ran into trouble for failing to list the boat as an asset on his welfare forms, which led to his arrest for welfare fraud in 1990. Afterward, the family lived in a school bus for a while. By the late 1990s, Marcus and Elizabeth managed to secure a home by using their children's earnings to buy a building in Fresno. Now, here's the most important point to remember about this case. In the year of 1993, Marcus Wesson became absolutely obsessed with David Koresh during the Branch Davidian siege in Waco, Texas. He took this unhealthy obsession and twisted it into something even more horrifying, transforming his family into his own personal cult. Wesson began to see himself as Jesus Christ and everyone else, including police officers, as Satan. When the family watched the news coverage of the siege, Marcus told the children, "This is how the world is attacking God's people. This man is just like me. He is making children for the Lord. That's what we should be doing, making children for the Lord." But it didn't stop there. Marcus went so far as to have his children make a chilling suicide pact. They were told that if the police or the government ever tried to separate them, the strongest child would be the one to end it all, shooting everyone in the head. His reasoning? If they were ever torn apart, they would all die together. But there was one catch. One child was to survive, to live and tell the tale. And who did Marcus want to be that survivor? Himself. This isn't just a man with delusions of grandeur. This is a psychopath. A man so twisted, narcissistic, and disgusting, he would manipulate and control his own family to satisfy his egotistical fantasies. And while living in their new home in Fresno, life was far from ideal. The house needed thousands of dollars in repairs, and guess who was doing all the work? You guessed it, Elizabeth and her children. Meanwhile, Marcus sat back, bossing them around without lifting a finger. With no stable income, the girls worked as banquet servers at a hotel. This made Marcus even more paranoid, fearing they'd talk to anyone about their situation or, worse, interact with men at work. Despite being punished daily with a baseball bat for the smallest reasons, often when they hadn't done anything wrong, Ruby, the same niece who escaped earlier, couldn't help but fall in love with one of her co-workers. In 2001, Ruby decided she had had enough. She ran away with her boyfriend and moved in with his mother, cutting all ties with Marcus. She even quit her job to make sure he wouldn't find her. When Marcus tried to get her back, calling her and pleading with her to return, she made it clear she was done. On the other hand, Sophina, another niece and Marcus's wife, had formed a close bond with one of her co-workers. She was perhaps the saddest member of the family, as Marcus forbade her from speaking to anyone, even her own family. So, when she found a safe space with this co-worker, she felt comfortable enough to open up about what was happening at home. Their friendship quickly turned into something more, and they became a couple. Eventually, Sophina decided she could no longer live under Marcus's control. She left, saying she wasn't happy in the household anymore and was planning to stay with her parents. However, Marcus quickly tracked her down and demanded that she return. He said he would consent to her living at her mother's house, but her 2 years' worth of pay would be sent to him. Additionally, if she didn't work during the day, she would have to stay with Marcus, but could do what she wanted at night. Sophina reluctantly agreed to Marcus's conditions. However, it didn't take long before Sophina dropped a bombshell on Marcus. She was pregnant by her co-worker, the same one she had gotten close to earlier. This didn't sit well with Marcus, and he immediately kicked her out of the house, claiming she was a bad influence on the other girls. Around this time, the Wesson family was facing yet another financial struggle. The house they had been trying to repair was becoming a money pit, and they were falling short on their mortgage payments. Despite the growing problems, in July of 2003, the family managed to sell the house for $50,000, more than they had originally paid for it. This unexpected profit allowed them to pay off their debts, with a little left over to ease the financial strain. But Marcus wasn't content to let things settle. In October of the same year, he bought a new property in Fresno, located at 761 West Hammond Avenue. However, this wasn't just any ordinary home. The property was actually a commercial space, which immediately raised red flags. Marcus didn't stop there. He also purchased a school bus and a limousine, along with a bizarre addition: wooden coffins. It's unsettling to think that the children, who were already living in such a warped environment, often slept in these coffins, adding another layer of horror to their lives. By December of 2003, another member of the family, Gypsy, Marcus's niece, couldn't take it anymore. She ran away from home, and while she didn't have children with Marcus, she had been a victim of his abuse since she was just 8 years old. She had always known deep down that something wasn't right, and finally, she found the courage to leave. But the Wesson family's troubles didn't end there. The city of Fresno stepped in, informing them that they had to relocate. The house Marcus had purchased wasn't zoned for residential living, which made it unsuitable for the family to stay. They were given until March 12, 2004, to vacate the premises. On top of that, the old school bus Marcus had parked on the property was in violation of city codes, and he had done nothing to fix it. With all the mounting problems, Marcus decided to relocate to Washington State, where his equally abusive parents lived. His father, Ben, was still alive, but had been diagnosed with cancer, which seemed like a perfect excuse to move. To prepare for the journey, his daughters took it upon themselves to renovate the school bus into a camper, something that would allow the family to travel to Washington in style. But when Sofina and Ruby had learned of Marcus's decision to move, they decided to take action. They reached out to their relatives on their mother's side, who had never agreed with Marcus and were just as determined to put an end to his control. Together, they came up with a bold plan. And their plan was simple. They would demand the children's release from Marcus. If he refused, the men in the family would confront him, and the women would go into the house to take the children. The date they chose for their move was no coincidence. It was the same day that the Wesson family had to vacate their home, March 12, 2004. Ruby and Sofina arrived in the afternoon, and without wasting time, they demanded the return of the children. As expected, Marcus refused. The women, however, stood their ground, making it clear they would not leave without the kids. They even pointed out a legal fact. On the children's birth certificates, Marcus was not listed as their father, which meant, by law, he was kidnapping them. If he didn't comply, they would involve the police. So, Sofina tried to enter the house, determined to get Jonathan, one of the children, but the other girls blocked her. Sabrina, Marcus's own daughter, was especially furious. She called Sofina a whore and an adulterer, demanding that Sofina bow down to Marcus, who she referred to as their master. Sabrina even led the other children into the back room, keeping them away from Sofina. Outside, the relatives who had come to help were losing patience. They kept urging Marcus to let the children go, but he was unmoved. The standoff continued, and finally, one of the relatives decided to call 911. The call was urgent, but it would take a shocking 22 minutes for the police to arrive. It was only after multiple calls to emergency services that they began to take the situation seriously. By the time the police finally showed up, the tension was unbearable. The police explained to Marcus that he had no legal right to take the children unless he had custody. As they tried to reason with him, Marcus quietly slipped back into the house and locked the door behind him. Moments later, gunshots rang out from inside the house. The officers rushed in, and minutes later, Marcus emerged from the house covered in blood. The police wasted no time in arresting him. When they entered the back room, the horrifying scene they found left them stunned. Sabrina, aged 25, Lise, aged 17, Illabel, aged 8, Aviv and Jonathan, aged 7, Ethan, aged 4, Sedona and Marshy, both just 18 months, and Jeva Wesson, only 1 year old, were all found dead, each shot in the eye. The massacre that had taken place inside the house was undeniable. Marcus was taken into custody immediately after he surrendered right outside the home, his bloodied clothes marking the aftermath of the horrific event. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, some of Marcus's surviving sons and family members continued to defend him, insisting that he had been a wonderful father and that he could never hurt anyone. However, as time passed and they received years of counseling, their perspective began to change. Slowly, they came to understand the immense amount of abuse they had endured at the hands of the man they had once considered their gentle father. On March 3, 2005, the trial of Marcus DeLon Wesson, also known as the Vampire King of Fresno, began. He stood accused of the brutal murder of his 9 children. During the trial, Marcus pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that Sabrina, his daughter, had actually been the one to pull the trigger on her siblings before turning the gun on herself. This claim, however, was met with skepticism. After months of deliberation, the jury found Marcus guilty of 9 counts of murder, as well as 14 counts of coerced intimacy and continuous SA of his underage daughters. Although it could not be conclusively proven that Marcus had fired the fatal shots, the jury was convinced that he had manipulated his children into a twisted suicide pact. The mental abuse and coercion he had inflicted on them over the years left them vulnerable and broken. Even if Sabrina had been the one to pull the trigger, it was clear that Marcus's influence had driven her to do so. In July of 2005, Marcus was sentenced to death for his crimes, bringing a tragic chapter of abuse and violence to its grim conclusion. Now, Marcus Wesson is 78 years old, still sitting on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. Elizabeth, the mother, and the other children spent years trying to overcome the scars left by Marcus, the man they once called their father. They were all victims of his monstrous actions, victims of a twisted system they had no control over. But here's something to think about. Could his parents have been just as responsible for what Marcus became? His abusive upbringing seemed to play a significant role in shaping him into the man he is right now. Marcus wasn't just born evil. His environment, the horrors he lived through as a child, likely shaped his mindset. Could it be that the cycle of abuse went back even further? Comment down below.
I just wanted to see it through to the end. Joseph was a great brother, a great father. He would have done anything to protect those boys in Summer.
This is Michael McStay. On February 4th, 2010, his brother, Joseph McStay, along with Joseph's wife, Summer, and his sons, Gianni and Joseph Jr., suddenly went missing. Over the next few years, both amateur and professional investigators, as well as relatives of the McStay family, put forth countless theories trying to explain their absence. How had the McStays just vanished without a trace? Where had they gone? Why had they left unannounced? And most importantly, what happened to them? The answers to all these questions came years after the McStays disappeared. Today, we're going to dive into their mysterious case and the sudden revelation about their gruesome, barbaric fate. Joseph McStay was born in the town of Spring, Texas, to Suzanne and Patrick McStay. When his parents divorced, his mother got custody of Joseph and his brother Michael and took him to California. From the very beginning, Joseph had a sort of entrepreneurial spirit. He wanted to make things and sell them to people. He wanted a business of his own. In 1995, he started a company called Earth Inspired Products. Specializing in high-end fountains with gorgeous stonework, the business was an instant hit, and pretty soon Joseph had to bring people in to help him run things. His first employee was Dan Kavanaugh, a web designer that helped him bring his business to a much bigger audience. Shortly after, Joseph hired Charles Merritt, usually referred to as Chase. Chase specialized in welding and helped Joseph assemble the fountains. And it's safe to say that he and Joseph were very close friends. Sometime during the mid-2000s, Joseph met a woman named Summer Martelli. She was a successful real estate agent, the sort of person that had just the attitude Joseph liked in people. She was energetic, motivated, and ambitious, just like Joseph. It didn't take them long to start dating, and pretty soon they had a baby boy on the way. They named this boy Gianni, and they got married shortly after he was born in 2007. By 2009, the McStays had added another baby boy to their growing family. They named this one Joseph, after his father. And not long after he was born, they started looking for a house suited to a larger family. They both loved California and found out about a town down south called Fallbrook. Located in San Diego County, Fallbrook was a quiet town with just around 25,000 people living in it. It was known for one thing: avocados. In fact, the people of Fallbrook were so obsessed with avocados that they held a festival for it every year. When Joseph and Summer visited Fallbrook, they saw a place where their kids could grow up peacefully and safely. They saw the potential for a long, happy life together. And so, Joseph headed down to Fallbrook to find a home for his family.
Good job. All right. So obviously I'll change the flooring. This will all be hardwood. Bust out a hole in this wall. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
It was a beautiful place. Not too big, not too small, just the right size for a family of 4, with room for a couple more, of course, just in case Joseph and Summer decided to expand their family a bit further. In December of 2009, the McStays moved to Fallbrook. Some reports suggest that Earth-inspired products was worth about $1 million, so the family was doing extremely well. Indeed, videos from Joseph's own YouTube account show them living a positively idyllic lifestyle.
Wow, look how perfect it is. That looks absolutely perfect. How did you do it? Yeah? You made it with this Italian cappuccino machine?
See, when you put it on, it makes the cream up. I saw how they work. See,
and you steamed it up the milk for Mama's cappuccino? Yeah. And you made the coffee right here, the real deal, baby?
Yeah,
but didn't you have to grind the espresso beans first? Yeah. For the coffee? Isn't that done over here?
All was well, or at least it seemed that way. No one that saw this family would think that anything bad was happening under the surface. And indeed, all evidence points to the McStays truly being as happy as they appeared to be. But all of that changed in early 2010 when they seemed to fall off the face of the earth. On the morning of February 4th, 2010, the McStay family was as busy as they could be. Summer had to oversee home renovations, since the family was still trying to turn the house into a home after moving in just a short while ago. While she held down the fort at home, Joseph headed to a Chick-fil-A to have a meeting with Chase. They spoke several more times throughout the day, and as it turns out, Chase Merritt was the last person to ever see Joseph alive.
As far as you know, you were the last person, or at least one of the last people to see him, right?
Yeah. When he left Rancho Cucamonga, nobody else, although I think there's another person or two that he talked to, I'm not sure.
But you were the last person he saw.
I'm definitely the last person he saw.
At around 8:30 p.m., Chase received a call from Joseph, which he didn't answer. He later claimed that he was watching a movie at the time, and probably thought he could get back to Joseph the next day. Little did he know, this was the last point of contact for the McStay family. The next day, Joseph's dad became slightly confused when his son didn't give him a call. Joseph made a habit of calling his dad every single day, so it was certainly unusual for him to just skip it randomly one day. Even so, this wasn't the scariest thing in the world. Joseph was a busy man with a business to run and a home to renovate, so it was perfectly understandable that he might not have been able to call him on a certain day. What was stranger was that neither Joseph nor Summer seemed to be answering anyone else's calls either. The days stretched on, and their families started to get concerned, although still not to the point where they called the police. You see, Joseph and Summer were the sort of people that loved taking unplanned vacations. They just pack up a few things and drive off with the kids, reappearing a few days with fresh tans and wide smiles. Their families assumed that they were off on one of their adventures. But by February 9th, at least one person started to get concerned: Chase Merritt. He called up Joseph's brother, Michael, expressing concern that the McStays had been AWOL for so long. The next day, Joseph's mom, Suzanne, asked Chase to head to their house and check up on him. When Chase got there, everything seemed pretty normal, except for the family dogs being locked outside. While Joseph and Summer enjoyed impromptu getaways, they always left responsibly. Leaving their dogs outdoors was not something they'd ever do. So this was the first sign that something might be amiss. On February 11th, concerned neighbors started to get involved, asking police to come and conduct a welfare check. Police came and found no signs of forced entry, and since they couldn't enter the home without a search warrant, they headed back to the station without any further investigation. It wasn't until February 13th that someone thought to look inside the house. This was when Chase and Michael found their way in through an unlocked window and found several signs that the McStays had left in a bit of a hurry.
Now, somebody's seen the vehicle leave that night. I don't know who. Now, that's what detective...
Do you know what they look like?
The lady,
No.
Well, the lady 2 doors down, 3 doors down maybe, she said she called the detective and told him that she remembered that she had seen a big truck, white truck, pull up here.
A white truck.
Yeah, big
Chase has a white truck with a gray truck. It's an old SBC truck.
There you go.
It's a Chevy 2500 with a box truck on back.
She said that she called the detective and she said she remembers.
How long ago did she call the detective?
I don't know.
Well, which door is it? Let's go knock on her door. I'll go talk to her right now.
While searching the home, Michael found out that Summer had left her prescription glasses behind. There was rotting food in the fridge. Every inch of the house seemed to suggest that the McStays hadn't gone off on a planned trip. On the 15th of February, the McStay family was finally reported missing. An investigation ensued, one that would reach dead end after dead end. Since it had been over 10 days since the McStays disappeared, the case was handed over to the homicide squad. Oddly enough, even though the residence was an active crime scene, police allowed Michael and Suzanne to enter. Suzanne wanted to clean up, claiming that she just needed something to keep herself busy. Michael, in the meantime, took Joseph's laptop home, though he returned it to the investigators according to their instructions. The very fact that he was able to take such a vital piece of evidence home in the first place was extremely unusual. When police finally started looking into the case, they turned their attention to the family's white Isuzu. At around 7:47 p.m. on February 4th, the vehicle was recorded by a neighbor's security camera heading away from the residence. This raised a few eyebrows. It was an oddly late hour to go off on a trip, which further suggested that the McStays had either run away haphazardly or they were forcibly removed from their home. However, it bears mentioning that the car in the security footage simply resembled the McStay family vehicle. It could have just been another car of the same make and model. But what police found out for sure was that the McStays' white Isuzu had been towed by authorities from a parking lot near the Mexico border. To be more specific, the car had been parked outside a San Diego strip mall that was known for being the last stop that people made before crossing over into Mexico. Authorities estimated that it had been left there between 5:30 and 7 p.m. on February 8th, although they had no idea where the car had been in the previous 4 days. Another thing that they could be certain of was that Joseph was still in Fallbrook at 8:30 on February 4th. The call that he made to Chase was traced to a local cell tower, so the family hadn't left the town just yet. Police now had the extremely difficult task of finding out what happened between 8:30 on February 4th and 5:30 on February 8th. More importantly, they needed to figure out why the family had just left their car behind and where they headed afterwards. Since the family vehicle was found right outside the Mexico border, investigators assumed that the family had headed south. And yet, it was the manner of their exit that confused everyone. It was almost like they were trying to run away from something. or someone. Some rumors started circling about Joseph being involved with Mexican cartels. And while this theory was completely random, it wasn't the craziest rumor people floated about the McStays. When police went through Summer's search history, they found out that she'd been looking into a trip to Mexico. She'd apparently been looking up the documents required to cross over into Mexico, and had even been searching what it was like to live south of the border. On top of that, it seemed like Summer had been learning Spanish. Was this all for a family trip, or had she been planning to flee to Mexico for some reason? It would have been extremely bizarre if that were the case, especially since she and Joseph had just bought a home a few months ago. But as it turns out, there was already a theory that tried to explain all that, and it painted Summer as the villain of the story. One of the proponents of this theory was Rick Baker, a radio host that interviewed Michael and became interested in the case. He suggested that Summer had slowly been poisoning Joe, and that she wanted to take the kids to Mexico once her husband was dead. This was a theory that even Chase supported, or at the very least, he confirmed that Joseph had been suffering from some kind of mysterious illness right before he and his family disappeared.
Extreme dizziness, nausea. He went to the doctors several times. I couldn't find anything.
Chase also suggested that Summer was an extremely controlling person, almost to the point where she was abusive. This made it seem all the more likely that she'd taken her husband's life. But once again, this theory proved baseless. Summer's name was dragged through the mud, but there was just too much evidence against this theory. For starters, she hadn't made any major withdrawals before going missing, which she most certainly would have done if her plan was to escape. And secondly, the fact that she left her prescription glasses behind also refuted the theory, because she would have had all the necessary belongings packed up if she'd been planning Joseph's murder. In the end, one element of this theory remained part of the investigation, namely, that murder was involved. The McStays had been gone for so long that they were almost certainly deceased, so the police started looking for suspects. The McStays didn't have any enemies, but there were a couple people that stood to gain from their deaths. Firstly, there was Dan Cavanaugh, the web developer that helped Joseph's business become such a great success. He'd allegedly argued with Joseph about how much money he was getting paid, and as it turns out, he withdrew $7,000 right after Joseph disappeared. Could Dan be the culprit? The police chased down the lead, but Dan's credit card history showed that he'd been in Hawaii during that time, so he couldn't possibly be involved. Eventually, the case grew cold. Police theorized that the McStays had driven to San Cierto and crossed the border voluntarily, but this would turn out to be completely false. You see, the killer had inserted himself into the investigation. He'd been hiding in plain sight all along, and it would take 4 whole years for him to be brought to justice. On November 11th, 2013, a motorcyclist traveling through the Mojave Desert found 2 shallow graves. Each contained the body of an adult and a child. He called the police, and when investigators arrived, they found a massive sledgehammer nearby that they took in for analysis. They found that the hammer had paint used at the McStay home and may have been a tool from the renovation process. The bodies were successfully identified as that of the McStays, and the sledgehammer was confirmed to be the murder weapon. What's more, police found tracks from truck tires nearby. Since they were in a remote part of the desert, they were perfectly preserved. So police were able to compare them to the tracks of trucks belonging to people the McStays knew. One of them proved to be a perfect match: Chase Merritt. The impounded Isuzu was checked again, this time more thoroughly. Last time around, police had assumed the family had crossed the border voluntarily, but now they knew they needed to take a closer look. They found DNA evidence which once again matched that of Chase Merritt. Then came the cell phone records. According to Chase's phone records, he'd been at that exact spot on the 6th of February, 2 days after the McStays went missing. All the evidence, circumstantial though it was, pointed to Merritt being the culprit. On November 5th, 2014, he was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. With the suspect now in custody, police could try to piece together what had happened. It turned out that Merritt had a criminal history stretching back 4 decades. His exploits included burglary, trespassing, and receiving stolen goods. These facts made Summer dislike him, which is possibly why he tried to pin her as the culprit during his interview. He also happened to have a serious gambling problem, and his debts had been growing every year. And he wasn't just in debt with the casinos either. Merritt had also started borrowing money from Joseph at some point, and he owed him about $40,000 by the time of his disappearance. And that was just the money Joseph knew about. On top of everything else, Merritt had allegedly been forging checks in Joseph's name. He'd use his access to Joseph's account to cash the check and then delete the transaction. But this could only go on for so long. When the matter came to trial, prosecutors stated that Joseph might have discovered Merritt's financial misdeeds. It's possible that he confronted him about them, because Merritt happened to cash a forged check on February 4th. It's possible that this is why Joseph tried calling Merritt, and that the perpetrator eventually headed to the McStay residence. Police theorized that Merritt killed Joseph and his entire family on February 4th, but waited until the 6th to drive their bodies out to the Mojave Desert. The McStays never went to Mexico. They'd never even left California. Merritt had buried him right outside the town of Victorville in a patch of desert that he never thought anyone would come across. He then remained closely involved in the investigation to seem as innocent as possible, and it worked for nearly 4 years. Merritt tried to delay his trial multiple times by firing attorneys and even claiming health issues at one point. But in the end, he wasn't able to evade justice. He was convicted on all 4 accounts, with a sentence of life imprisonment for the murder of Joseph McStay, along with the death penalty for killing Summer and the kids.
First, I would like to say I am so very sorry that Joseph's, Summer's, and Joseph Jr.'s family. But the thing that is bringing you this solace is ending my life. Ending my life for a crime that I did not commit.
Merritt has maintained his innocence to the very end. He's claimed that he loved the McStays and that he's not the person responsible for this crime. But the evidence begged to differ. It painted the portrait of a man out of control, a man that killed a family to hide his financial indiscretions. Merritt currently sits on death row at San Quentin Prison, where he awaits his sentence. So what do you think of this case? Was Chase Merritt's financial desperation and betrayal of trust the driving force behind this horrifying act? Or do you think there's more to the story? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
The assault on Jane Curia was one of the most vicious that I had seen. And then seeing what had occurred with Jane's daughters and then what had happened to the little boys, it's hard to describe it. It was just completely shockingly evil that a person would do this.
On July 31st, 2007, 47-year-old Jane Curia and her family were attacked in their home in Powder Springs, Georgia. It was a vicious bludgeoning attack that left the victims unrecognizable. 3 people died that day, and the attacker clearly held some kind of anger in their heart for Jane and her family. It was the kind of rage that can only come from having a personal connection with someone. But could someone that knew the Curias really have done something so evil? And if they could, why would they brutalize their loved ones? On the other hand, could this attack have been committed by someone else entirely? Perhaps some criminal element was involved, or maybe it was just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Today, we're going to unpack the tragedy that unfolded on that day in July and retrace the Curia family's steps to the moment they first entered the United States. Jane Curia was born in Kenya, where she spent much of her life. However, she was the sort of person that couldn't tolerate injustices happening right before her eyes. The issue that she was perhaps most passionate about was female circumcision, often referred to as female genital mutilation, or FGM for short. In order to understand Jane's story, we must understand the cultural practice of FGM. There's no easy way to put it, no way to sugarcoat the sheer barbarity of it. Trigger warning for those that might not want to hear about it. Basically, FGM involves literally cutting off pieces of a woman's genitalia. Though it's sometimes called a circumcision, it's far more painful than male circumcision and is often performed without anesthesia or proper medical care. The physical pain is impossible to describe, but the psychological toll is perhaps even greater. What does this have to do with Jane's story? She herself had survived FGM as a child, and she grew up to be a vocal opponent to the practice. She spoke out courageously against the practice, despite the risks to her safety, and made sure that her daughters didn't have to go through anything like it. But criticizing a deeply ingrained cultural practice can be a risky proposition. People don't change their ways easily, especially when it comes to traditions regarding control over the bodies of women. So Jane's life was always in danger. In 2001, Jane's husband died of pneumonia, prompting her to bring her entire family to America and apply for asylum there. The fear of persecution was suffocating and ever-present, but even so, it must have been a tough decision. We all wish to change our country in some way, but that doesn't mean we don't love our homeland. Jane made the brave choice to leave her homeland to build a better future for her children, one where they wouldn't have to worry about their safety. By 2001, Jane had managed to settle down in Boston. She started to build a life for herself by getting a job as a nurse, and she was described as a bubbly, affectionate mother who managed to teach her kids good manners while also showering them with love. A year after she arrived in America, Jane decided to take her family away from the big city and all of its dangers.
Jane was unique. She was very bubbly. She was the life of the party. Her energy was amazing. She had this big, generous smile. Jeremy's two sisters, Isabella and Annabelle, loved their brother so much.
She had some relatives in this little town in Georgia called Powder Springs. There was a small Kenyan immigrant community there as well. Hoping to find some support in the familiar and the peace, quiet, and safety that comes with small town living, Jane packed up and headed down south. She had no way of knowing that Powder Springs would become her final resting place. Jane threw herself into her new life in Powder Springs. Being a single mom is hard, especially when you have to hold down a full-time job. Jane somehow managed to balance 2 jobs, all while being a constant comforting presence in her child's lives. She spent her days as a nurse at the local hospital and moonlighted as an RN at the local nursing home. Jane's naturally calming presence made her well-suited to these roles. People just felt comfortable around her. They felt like they could trust her.
Isabella was a really calm, cool, collected individual, but she was also very funny. My cousin Annabelle, we were the same age. Because she came to this country before I did, I like to say that she was the one that gave me a quick orientation of the U.S.
Her daughters, Isabel and Annabelle, took after her in many ways. Isabel was 19 years old at the time of the incident and had just come back from her first year at college in Chattanooga. She had her whole life ahead of her, a life that was made possible by her mother's brave decision to come to America and start from scratch. 16-year-old Annabelle was, in many ways, the town's darling. She volunteered at church, babysat the neighborhood kids, and was a great student at McEachern High School by all accounts. She was also a great older sister to Jeremy, the baby of the family, who was 7 years old at the time of the incident. The fact that Annabelle's mother was right there with her at church every Sunday just goes to show what an absolute powerhouse Jane was. 2 jobs, 3 kids, and regular church attendance. It's a miracle she found time to eat or sleep. What this shows was that Jane was a woman of discipline. She was fiercely independent and was the living embodiment of the American dream. But she still needed support from time to time. Luckily, Powder Springs was the sort of place where she found a proper community to lean on. There were her fellow churchgoers, of course, but Jane also needed someone to confide in. One of the members of the congregation, Patrick, also happened to live close by and developed a close bond with Jane. There are rumors that the two were romantically involved, but there's simply no evidence of that. Patrick actually had a wife and kids, and Jane simply didn't seem like the sort of person who would interfere with a marriage like that. What we can say for sure is that Jane and Patrick talked every single day. Not only would they meet in person, but they'd call over a dozen times a day as well. It's safe to say that Patrick was one of the most important people in Jane's life. But then again, there are certain signs that Patrick isn't who he seemed to be. Patrick was friendly. Some might even say too friendly. He helped Jane with chores around the house, even though he had kids of his own. And whenever he needed someone to look after his children, Annabelle was ready to lend a helping hand. This is where some people might start raising their eyebrows. You see, Patrick didn't pay Annabelle for her babysitting in cash. No, he took her out to dinner instead. Now, this could just be something completely innocent. Jane clearly knew about it, and she didn't seem to have a problem with it. Perhaps Patrick was like an uncle to Annabelle, a grown-up outside her own family that the 16-year-old could talk to. With that said, some have also suggested that he might have been grooming her. Again, there's no evidence to support this. Doctors Amy Schlossberg and Megan Sachs, both of whom have a PhD in criminology, have floated the theory that Patrick might have had bad intentions when it came to Annabelle, and that Jane found out about it. Could this be the cause of the vicious attacks on July 31st? Maybe, maybe not. The grooming theory alone isn't enough to support it. But there's another fact that might strike you as odd, if not outright incriminating. Like I've said before, Patrick and Jane called each other daily. In fact, there were over 300 calls between them in the month of July alone. And it wasn't uncommon for Patrick to ring her up 15 times in a single day. And yet, on the day of the incident, before he'd even found out about what happened to Jane and the kids, Patrick only called her once. A single call after months of dozens of calls. Could this just be a coincidence? It would be an incredible one if so. It doesn't necessarily implicate Patrick in what happened that day, but it does make him a person of interest. Indeed, police did include him in their list of persons of interest when the investigation began. But the case has now gone cold, and many years have passed. It's time to walk through the events leading up to that day and discuss the details of what happened to the Curia family. The year preceding the summer of 2007 was a hard one for Jane. She'd been living in America for 2 years, waiting for her asylum application to go through the whole time. In 2006, she learned that her application had been denied. Apparently, fearing retribution for criticizing a barbaric, misogynistic practice wasn't enough to grant her asylum. The fact that she worked overtime, attended church regularly, and focused on her family wasn't enough to give her the chance to become an American. Jane didn't take this rejection lying down, though. She immediately filed an appeal, and there's some evidence to suggest that she got involved in real estate as well. This will be an important factor later on. But for now, just remember that Jane was working overtime to make everything happen. The year was made even more difficult by the fact that Isabel went off to college. The empty nest syndrome might not have hit as hard because Isabel and Jeremy were still around. But it probably still hurt to wake up one day and realize her daughter wasn't around. She was all grown up and building her own life. But at least Jane could look forward to her coming home that summer. And there was more to look forward to as well. Jane had just gotten word that her sister-in-law, Pauline Thande, would be visiting America that summer. Her son Peter, affectionately called PK, would be visiting as well, which was an exciting prospect for Jeremy, since he'd get the chance to play with someone his own age. The stage was set for a summer of rest and relaxation, which makes the events of July 31st all the more tragic. On July 29th, Pauline dropped PK off at Jane's place for a sleepover with Jeremy. The kids spent the day playing outside before finally settling in for the night. It was a perfectly normal day. Pauline had no reason to suspect that PK would be in danger. Later investigation revealed that around 3 a.m., an attack occurred at the Curia residence. Whoever committed the attack was probably familiar to Jane because police found no signs of forced entry. What happened next was one of the most vicious attacks that those investigators had ever seen. Jane had been bludgeoned to death in the kitchen. The sheer ferocity of the attack made it seem like she was the primary victim, and that the kids in the house were only attacked after they were awoken by the noise. Isabel came running down the stairs to find out what was happening, while Annabelle lingered in the doorway to her bedroom, waiting for her sister to give an update. Isabel managed to make it to the front of the stairs before she too was attacked and beaten to death. The assailant then climbed up to the bedroom where he found Annabelle and attacked her as well, leaving her dead in the hallway. It's likely that Jeremy and PK were in bed this whole time. They may have been frozen with fear, or perhaps they just thought that this was something for the grown-ups to deal with. Either way, this unidentified assailant entered the bedroom where they were sleeping and struck them multiple times as well.
I could tell the item that was used as a weapon was at least 12 or 15 inches long, something that was not very large in diameter. The injuries also showed that at least one end of this tool that was used as a weapon was forked.
After the deed was done, the assailant cleaned up the scene of the crime and left. No one in the vicinity had any idea what had just happened. On July 31st, Pauline tried calling Jane to see if she could come pick PK up. The call was not answered, but Pauline had no reason to think anything was wrong. She sends her son Owen to check up on the curias, and he arrives to find both Jane and Isabel's cars in the driveway. Assuming this meant they were safe and sound, Owen headed back home. However, Pauline started getting worried on the 1st of August. It had now been days since Jane had gotten back to her. This just wasn't like her. Jane was a responsible person, and she'd make sure to call Pauline back to let her know that PK was safe, if nothing else. Starting to panic, she asks her niece, Diana, to accompany her to the curia residence. When they arrive, they find that the front door is locked. The assailant clearly didn't leave through the front, but there was a sliding glass door at the back, and Diana decided to use it to gain entry. She couldn't believe what she saw.
Originally from Kenya, Jane Curia moved to Georgia in 2002 with her 3 children, following the death of her husband the year before.
Noticed the sliding door was still slightly open. I opened the sliding door, I pushed the blinds, and it was total darkness. And as I went to go put my foot into the door, that's when I saw a pool of blood on the floor.
Diana is in a state of shock. All she can do is call out to Pauline to stay outside, while she herself exits the home and calls the police. Officers arrive a few minutes later, and they start to cordon off the scene of the crime. The good news was that Jeremy and PK were still alive. However, Jane, Isabel, and Annabelle had all died in the brutal attack. Police now had to search for a killer that had committed this act of evil so efficiently that they'd left behind no trace. The first person of interest was, of course, Patrick. As soon as the lead detective checked phone records, he saw that Patrick hadn't called Jane in the past 2 days, which was a major shift in his routine. When he was asked about this unusual behavior, he couldn't explain why he hadn't called. He had no way of knowing Jane was dead prior to August 1st, unless he'd been involved in some way. Not long after, another suspicious detail came to light. Jane had apparently lent Patrick $5,000, and though he freely admitted to the loan and said that she wasn't pressuring him to pay her back, this definitely created probable cause. Patrick raised further suspicions when he effectively tried to derail the investigation by claiming that organized criminals from Kenya might somehow be involved, specifically the Mungiki gang.
Patrick told me that Jane had shared with him that her husband was murdered by the Mungiki gang in Kenya years earlier.
However, when investigators looked into Jane's husband's death certificate, they found the official cause to be pneumonia. They also felt that it was logistically impossible for Kenyan criminals to enter the country just to murder someone. This act had to be committed by an individual based in America. Despite the heavy suspicion levied at Patrick, there was no real evidence connecting him to the crime. But in the aftermath of Jane's death, another person ended up becoming heavily involved in the goings-on, a relative named Elizabeth. Jane had mentioned a very lucrative real estate deal she was involved in just a few months before she was murdered. This made her a target for anyone that wanted to acquire that cash, and Elizabeth may have targeted her for that reason. But even if we ignore that theory, Elizabeth's actions after Jane's murder were highly suspicious. She immediately tried to take custody of Jeremy and started selling off Jane's assets, and she wasn't doing any of this for Jeremy.
There's nothing that I could do at that time. No one can come and see me without her knowing what was taken and put into the trust accounts. I've never had access to it. When I ask about it, I'm told that I'll tell you later.
What's more, she was extremely controlling of Jeremy, acting more like a school principal than a maternal figure. But despite Elizabeth's suspicious behavior, there was nothing linking her to the murder either. It's possible that she was simply trying to profit off of her relative's sudden death. Her intentions are unclear, and she hasn't made any public statements on the matter. Eventually, Jeremy was able to go back to Kenya where he studied medicine. He later recalled seeing a man in what he described as a shirt with an African pattern on it the night of the murder, but has no other recollections of that day. The thing he remembers most of all is waking up in a hospital bed a week after the attack, with no idea what happened to him or his family. So what do you think of this case? Was Jane Cobb the intended target, or was someone else in the family caught in the crosshairs of a deadly grudge? Could advances in DNA technology finally uncover the truth after all these years? If you'd ever seen Clyde and Jessica out on the street, you wouldn't have spared them a second glance. That's how utterly normal they were. That's how seamlessly they blended into the fabric of Milbank, South Dakota, a small town that they'd called home for many years. They had an infant son named Ty, and another baby on the way that they'd named Anika. But as it turns out, there was a wolf in their midst as well. 10 days before Christmas 2021, Clyde's brother Brent was called over to the station by Police Chief Boyd Van Voren for 2 reasons. Firstly, he wanted to exchange Christmas cards with Hansen, and secondly, he wanted to ask about how things were at home. There'd been reports of disturbance at the Hansen residence, especially regarding tension between Hansen and his sister-in-law. When the police chief asked Hansen if there were any updates on the situation, all Hansen had to say was, they no longer live there. Live is the operative word here. Jessica and her husband Clyde were no longer alive. How did this happen? What factors were involved? What did the rather tense history between Brent and Jessica have to do with the incident? And why was he living with his brother and sister-in-law anyway? These are just some of the questions we'll attempt to answer today, so stay tuned while we unpack this horrific case. Brett Hansen was not the sort of person that mixed well with others. Indeed, even members of his own community have spoken out against him, with allegations of harmful conduct stretching all the way back to the 80s. During his youth, Hansen was heavily involved in religious activities. As a Jehovah's Witness, he frequently worked at administrative centers called Bethels, where the volunteers are called Bethelites. This suggests that Hansen was not only devout, but committed to supporting his religion practically at the organizational level as well. However, there have been unconfirmed allegations against him of gross misconduct. Bethel leaders received reports that he'd acted inappropriately with women of the community, and as a result, Hansen was sent home early. He was allegedly accused of sexual deviancy, a term that could mean anything from harassment or assault. These allegations may not be true, but they come from one of Brent's nieces, who herself claims to have been abused by him.
And throughout the years, my uncle abused me severely, and Watchtower and Bethel and all the elders didn't listen.
It's clear that while the Bethel leaders didn't want Hansen around their offices, they didn't think his actions were bad enough to report to the police. This led to him continuing the chain of abuse, and even his family members weren't safe from his perverse inclinations. What's even more tragic is that the victims' families gave him much support. According to the aforementioned victims, whose name has been redacted to maintain their privacy, even her father didn't want to lend his support in any way. The survivor of his abuse moved away when she grew up, hoping to try and start fresh. But a sudden incident occurred that brought her and the eventual victims of his homicidal rage, Clyde and Jessica, back to being within his reach. On December 7th, 2020, Margaret Iona Hansen passed away at the age of 94. She had 7 sons, namely Gary, Arden, Morris, Laverne, Clyde, and the youngest son, Brent. She also had a daughter named Wendy Basudel. Out of her children, only 3 were married at the time of her death: Gary, Rick, and Clyde. In a stomach-churning twist, Morris had done time in prison for the sexual assault of a minor. Her children came from Minnesota all the way to Arizona, although Rick, Laverne, Clyde, Brent, and Wendy still lived in Milbank. It was a family reunion of sorts, though not for the unnamed survivor that bravely told her story in a now-deleted YouTube video.
I hadn't seen anybody in a really long time. And it was really hard being shunned because I was the only one being shunned. My father didn't even say anything to me. But instead, he sat behind me during the funeral with my murdering uncle. And he talked to him the whole time.
The innocent woman, whose only crime was being related to a predator that set his sights on her, was shunned by her own family. It's a sign of the deep lack of regard that so many communities give to survivors of abuse. Oftentimes, the victims are the ones that have to swallow their rage and sorrow and find peace elsewhere, because neither the family nor the community cares. It might not happen all the time, but it happens often enough that this woman had to watch as Brent Hansen only escalated his desire to cause pain to others. One member of the Hansen family that his unnamed survivor talked to was Jessica. Brent was about to move in with her and Clyde, and she had no idea what kind of person he was. The survivor tried to tell Jessica that she was putting herself at risk by allowing Brent to stay with her, but it was no use. The Hansen family wanted to discredit the survivor for accusing Brent of abusing her when she was a child. And when so many people in the room were implying that she couldn't be trusted, Jessica was inclined to agree with them. The following year would prove to be one of the most stressful of Jessica's life. Jessica Hernandez was about 30 years younger than the man she eventually married. However, by all accounts, Clyde was a gentle and caring husband, and the couple were known for being devout and generous. Even so, Jessica, a native of New York, must have found the relatively quaint environment of South Dakota to be a bit of a culture shock. And then there was the fact that her brother-in-law was living with her. Brent occupied the basement portion of the home, while Clyde and Jessica lived on the upstairs floor. Clyde had a decent job in merchandise marketing at a local retail outlet, and he was able to afford a good life for his wife and son. With another baby on the way, Clyde and Jessica were clearly looking to the future, hoping that they could grow their family. Clyde's mother had had 8 children, so it's possible that he wanted something like that himself. Little Ty was the center of their lives, but Jessica had a life outside the home as well. She joined a book club in town and was well known throughout the community, so her social circle was quite full. In November of 2021, the members of her book club even threw her a surprise baby shower. It turned out to be the last time the group ever saw Jessica. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Jessica reportedly experienced poor mental health on several occasions over the course of the year. It's possible that these symptoms were caused by her pregnancy hormones, but it's also highly likely that Jessica was just depressed. By July of 2021, her mental health became so poor that she had to spend some time at a mental health facility. Since Clyde was always busy with work and also had to take care of their child, Jessica asked Brent to take care of the family dog. But for some reason, the dog just went missing while Jessica was away. When she returned, her beloved pet was nowhere to be found. And when she asked Brent about it, all he said was that he sent it to a farm. He refused to divulge the location of this farm, if it even existed in the first place. Just like that, Jessica had lost her dog to a man that clearly didn't see what the big deal was. While there's no way to confirm this, Hansen's behavior strongly suggests that he killed that dog. Sending a dog to a farm is a common euphemism used to describe a dog's passing to a child. Could Hansen have been using this specific phrase to subtly tell Jessica that he'd killed her dog? And if he did take it to a farm, why did he do that without the consent of the pet's owner? Hansen claimed that he just didn't want to have to take care of the dog. He also stated that if the dog came back, he might need to start caring for it again, which was something that he simply didn't want to do. Either way, the circumstances behind the dog's disappearance were suspicious, to say the least. But what followed was nothing short of shocking. Jessica was understandably upset that her dog had just been taken away from her without so much as a word. The fact that Hansen was refusing to be upfront about it or even consider getting the dog back made her angry. just like it would anyone else. It was at this point that Hansen unleashed the kind of fury that you'd never expect from this mild-mannered, normal-looking man. As Jessica told him to take some accountability and possibly try to convince that what he'd done was indeed a violation of trust, Hansen used all his might to shove her and then started slamming his fists down on her head. Remember, this is a woman that was 4 to 5 months pregnant at the time. The fact that she had a baby in her belly did nothing to quell Hansen's rage. It seemed as though he was angry at her for daring to question him at all. It's fair to say that the attack came from Hansen's misogyny. His belief that women were worth less than him, and that Jessica had no choice but to accept the decisions of men, no matter how ridiculous or hurtful they might be. It bears mentioning that Clyde was there at the time, and he stepped in to stop the assault. The police were called, and Jessica filed a report against her brother-in-law, leading to him getting charged with 2 counts of simple assault. But it seems as though he was bailed out of jail not long after. It's possible that one of his brothers helped him get out of jail as he awaited trial. Potentially even the father of the unnamed survivor that bravely told her story only to be ignored. It's important to draw attention to this fact. Hansen was enabled by his brothers, and even by the religious community. Bethel leaders and religious elders were aware of the kind of person he was. What happened next could have easily been stopped, but it wasn't. And as Christmas approached, Police Chief Van Voren heard something he'll never forget. It's time we circle back to the moment of the confession. Hansen exchanged Christmas cards with the police chief, and subsequently told him that Clyde and Jessica don't live there anymore. This was a conversation that lasted about 30 to 40 minutes, during which Hansen and the police chief exchanged pleasantries before Hansen made the curious statement. During this time, a food delivery driver passed by Clyde and Jessica's home and noticed blood pooling around the front door. He called this in to the police, and the information was relayed to Chief Van Voren right as Hansen was sitting in front of him. The chief asked Hansen to elaborate. What exactly did he mean when he said that Clyde and Jessica didn't live there anymore? Had they moved? If so, where to? All Hansen could say was that he'd snapped. He also reportedly made a gesture indicating the slicing of a throat while talking about what he'd done. Shocked and enraged, the police chief detained Hansen immediately and told him to start providing more details regarding what he'd done. On December 12th, Jessica was out possibly running some errands or potentially visiting the doctor. Since she was nearly 9 months pregnant by this point, she wouldn't be home until the next day. And with her out of the house, Clyde and his brother were alone together. Something that may have resulted in a bit of family bonding time if Hansen were anywhere close to being a normal human being. While his brother's back was turned, Hansen picked up a baseball bat and smashed Clyde's skull in with it. He struck him again and again and again until he finally stopped moving. After which, he hid Clyde's body behind some drywall and waited for Jessica to come back home. Oddly enough, little Ty wasn't harmed. In fact, Hansen took care of the child as he waited for a second victim to arrive. During this wait, he happened upon a machete, although it's unknown if he already had it in his possession or if he found it after murdering his brother. One possibility was that he wanted to simply kill Clyde for calling the police on him when he attacked Jessica. But as far as his sister-in-law was concerned, he wanted to make her bleed. On December 13th, Jessica came home and was immediately pounced on by Hansen. He hacked away at her pregnant body, leaving her with deep lacerations all across her body. One thing to note is that he didn't stab Jessica, at least according to the reports we've seen. Instead, he slashed her multiple times, making her death as slow and painful as he could. Once the deed was done, Hansen tossed a blue tarp over Jessica's body. He couldn't even stand to look at what he'd done, though he'd had no qualms about taking 3 innocent lives. But curiously, he never harmed Ty. He continued to take care of the child for the next few days until he was called into the station by the police chief. By that point, he probably knew there'd be no escaping it. Sooner or later, the police chief would find out what he'd done. And since he had no way to dispose of the bodies without being discovered, it's possible that he thought this was the only way for him to end this horrible situation. Or, on the other hand, it's possible that Hansen had had a complete psychotic breakdown and that he was there completely unaware of what he was saying. Perhaps the most likely explanation is this. He killed his brother and pregnant sister-in-law, possibly even the family dog, and didn't think much of it. Why he didn't kill Ty, we'll never know. But when police headed to the residence, they found the child screaming from hunger and dehydration. Hansen claimed he'd taken care of the child, but this proved to be yet another lie. It was the strangest thing they'd ever seen. The boy was now an orphan, but it seemed like he'd been reasonably well taken care of. The extremes in Hansen's mindset might very well be impossible to explain, but none of that mattered now. On December 15th, 3 days after he murdered his brother and sister-in-law, Hansen was charged with 3 counts of murder in the first degree and 3 counts of murder in the second degree. Charging Hansen with both first and second-degree homicide was an intentional strategy from the prosecutors. They were hoping that if Hansen's attorney was able to prove that the crime wasn't premeditated, the jury would at least convict the culprit on the second-degree murder charges and ensure he'd spend his life behind bars. However, Hansen was not trying to escape prison at all. At least, that's how it seemed. When the time came for him to enter a plea, he acknowledged what he'd done and said that he was guilty. Again, this was all part of the prosecution strategy. Prosecutors knew that there was always a chance of a mistrial or something else going wrong, so they gave Hansen an offer. If he pleaded not guilty, they'd use every scrap of evidence and every power at their disposal to ensure that he got the death penalty, something that was made all the more likely by him murdering Anika. But if he pleaded guilty, he'd be able to live out the rest of his days in a cold, dark cell. Hansen's self-preservation instinct kicked in here. He pleaded guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This caused an outcry among members of the family, who felt like Hansen hadn't got the kind of sentence he deserved. He was responsible for something so absolutely evil that they believed he deserved to die for it. If nothing else, he deserved to spend years on death row, uncertain of his own fate, constantly awaiting the announcement that today would be his last day. In a statement to the press, the family said, "We're heartbroken with the state attorney's brash decision to enter into this plea agreement without the knowledge or approval of the family. We're displeased with the work of the state attorney as we clearly stated to him that we wanted a trial for Jessica, Clyde, and Anika Hansen, and made it clear to him that we were seeking justice in the form of the death penalty. However, there's one wrinkle to the case that must be addressed. One member of the jury was reportedly against the death penalty. So if the prosecutors had gone that route, the chances of a mistrial would have been greatly increased. Instead, they decided to offer Hansen a plea deal to ensure he got a life term without them having to prove his guilt. In the end, no outcome would have brought Clyde, Jessica, and Anika back. Some will say that Hansen should have died for what he did. Others will say that he's at least behind bars where he can't hurt anyone again. With Ty now orphaned, the Hernandez family started trying desperately to bring him back to New York. They wanted him out of the South Dakota environment that led to him being confronted with such lifelong trauma. But a move like this required money, and lots of it. Jessica's cousin, Veronica Torres, set up a GoFundMe account to help pay for the expenses, and the amount was thankfully met. Ty's current status is unknown, but there's a chance that the Hansens might fight to keep him with them. Considering the presence of at least 2 predators in the family, one can only hope that the Hernandezes are able to get custody and bring Ty to safety. What drives a human being to commit such acts of violence? Oftentimes, these incidents are rooted in control, entitlement, and rage. Misogyny also often plays a role here. Family annihilators see their families as extensions of themselves, and they hate the idea of losing even the tiniest bit of control. When their sense of control is threatened by financial strain, relationship breakdowns, or personal failure, they may lash out in a twisted attempt to assert dominance or reclaim power. These acts are not random. They are calculated decisions fueled by anger and a desire to erase perceived problems. And yet, in the case of Brett Hansen, it's hard to find a motive. He didn't seem to be struggling financially, nor had he experienced a personal failure. It's possible that his brother Clyde intervening on Jessica's behalf rather than taking his side pushed him over the edge. While that might sound minor, it might just be how a man like Hansen thinks. After all, he described what he did to his brother and pregnant sister-in-law by running his thumb across his throat, almost as if the murders were a joke to him. Hansen hadn't expanded on what made him snap, as he described it. It's possible that he didn't snap at all, but instead executed a plan he'd been working on for quite some time. So what do you think of this case? Did the justice system fail Clyde, Jessica, and their unborn daughter Anika? Or was the plea deal the best option given the circumstances? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.